Kamala Harris in the 1980s. During that period, Harris studied at Howard University, a historically black institution in Washington, before pursuing law in California. Decades later, she would become the first woman and the first black person to hold the vice presidency of the United States, Dolly Parton and Carl Dean in 1964. The two met on the day Parton arrived in Nashville outside a laundromat and remained married for nearly 60 years. Dean completely avoided the spotlight throughout his entire life, almost never appearing publicly alongside his enormously famous wife over those 6 decades. Old-school public shaming in Times Square, 1955. Practices of public humiliation as informal punishment were still common in American urban spaces in the 20th century, generally applied to minor offenders, and reflecting the rigid moral codes of that particular post-war period in the United States. Halloween in the late 1990s, when South Park premiered on television. The series by Trey Parker and Matt Stone became an immediate phenomenon, and costumes of its characters dominated parties of that era. The irreverent humor and deliberately crude animation captivated an entire generation of young people. A rare photograph of Marvin before his 1994 accident, images of people captured shortly before events that would change their lives carry a particular weight, transforming an ordinary moment into a document laden with retrospective meaning for anyone who knows how the story eventually turned out. A Vietnam War protest in 1969. That was the year the anti-war movement reached its peak in the United States, with the October moratorium mobilizing millions of people. Popular pressure would prove decisive in the gradual withdrawal of American troops from Southeast Asia over the following years. Arnold Schwarzenegger on the day he became an American citizen in September 1983. The Austrian had arrived in the United States in 1968 with little money and poor English. He became a world bodybuilding champion, film star, and later governor of California, elected to that office twice. A 1963 Chevrolet Corvette split window. Produced during only one model year, the version with the divided rear window is today among the most coveted American cars for collectors. The designer himself wanted to keep the divider, but it was removed in 1964 because it impaired driver visibility. A woman is arrested for protesting against segregation in the 1960s. Thousands of demonstrators were detained during the American Civil Rights Movement, many of them practicing deliberate civil disobedience as a strategy to expose the injustice of segregationist laws to the entire country. Arnold Schwarzenegger being sworn in as an American citizen in 1983. The ceremony marked the end of a journey that began when he emigrated from Austria at 21. Schwarzenegger frequently described his naturalization as one of the most significant moments of his entire public life. An African-American demonstrator in Chicago in 1941. During that period, the movement for labor rights and against racial discrimination in war industries was gaining strength, resulting in Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in the hiring of defense industry workers. George Carlin being arrested after performing the controversial routine 7 words you can never say on television. The 1972 arrest triggered a legal case that reached the Supreme Court, becoming a fundamental precedent in defining the limits of free speech in the United States of America. Daft Punk performing without helmets around 1990. Thomas Bangalter and Guy Manuel de Homem Christo were then playing in a rock band called Darlin. They would only adopt the robot helmets in 2001, creating one of the best preserved and most commercially effective anonymities in modern music. An actual photograph of Albert Einstein giving a lecture on the theory of relativity in 1922. That same year, Einstein received the Nobel Prize in Physics, awarded not for relativity, but for his explanation of the photoelectric effect, work fundamental to the development of quantum mechanics. Jim Carrey at 19 and his peculiar hitchhiking method in 1981. The Canadian comedian was then living in precarious conditions in Toronto, working in comedy clubs. It would take more than a decade before Ace Ventura and The Mask transformed him into Hollywood's highest-paid actor. Betty Robinson survived a plane crash and was mistakenly declared dead. She spent 7 weeks in a coma and took years to walk normally again. Against all expectations, the American athlete returned to the track and won Olympic gold in the relay in Berlin in 1936, following her long recovery. Green Day at Woodstock in 1994. The band's performance became famous for the mud battle between audience and musicians, turning into one of the most remembered moments of the festival. The chaos helped cement the group's irreverent public image, as they were then rising rapidly on the strength of the album Dookie. Dave Chappelle and Carrie Elwes in 1993. Chappelle was only 19 and beginning his career in film and stand-up. A decade later, he would create Chappelle's Show, considered one of the most influential comedy programs in American television, which he would abandon at its peak on principle. Tony Hawk in the 1980s at a local skate park. Hawk turned professional at 14 and revolutionized vertical skateboarding, creating dozens of original tricks. In 1999, he would land the first 900 in competition history, a feat that defined his legend and popularized the sport worldwide. A young Lucy Liu in the 1990s. The actress studied Asian languages and culture before pursuing an artistic career, facing an industry with very few roles available for Asian actresses. She would gain prominence with Ally McBeal and later with Charlie's Angels and Tarantino's Kill Bill. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein watch Nixon's resignation. The pair of Washington Post reporters conducted the investigation that exposed the Watergate scandal, leading to the only presidential resignation in American history in August 1974. The case redefined the role of investigative journalism. Willem Dafoe in 1981. The actor was then connected to the Wooster Group, an experimental theater collective in New York, of which he would remain a member for decades. He would build one of Hollywood's boldest filmographies, alternating major productions with radical auteur cinema by independent directors. John F. Kennedy smoking a cigar. According to accounts, the president ordered 200 Cuban cigars purchased the day before signing the trade embargo against Cuba in 1962. The anecdote became one of the most cited episodes about the distance between political decisions and rulers' personal preferences. Jonas Salk did not patent his 1955 polio vaccine so that it would be accessible to everyone. Asked who owned the patent, he answered that it belonged to the people and asked whether one could patent the sun. The vaccine practically eradicated the disease within a few decades around the world. Star Wars on opening day, May 25, 1977. Nobody predicted the phenomenon. The studio had low expectations, and George Lucas traveled to Hawaii to avoid the anticipated failure. The film would become the highest-grossing movie in history to that point and completely transform the film industry. The Golden Gate Bridge opened to the public for the first time in 1937 and nearly gave way under the weight. On the day it opened to pedestrians, roughly 200,000 people crossed simultaneously, visibly flattening the central arch of the bridge and alarming the engineers responsible for the structure. The Star Wars cast in 1980, the year The Empire Strikes Back was released. The sequel surpassed the original in critical acclaim, with a darker tone and a narrative twist that would become among the most famous in cinema history, kept secret even from part of the production crew during filming. On the set of Hook in 1991. Steven Spielberg's film reimagined Peter Pan as an adult who had forgotten his childhood, with Robin Williams in the lead role and Dustin Hoffman as Captain Hook. The production featured one of the largest sets ever built on a soundstage in Hollywood up to that time. Terry Crews in 1986 voted The Classmate most likely to succeed. The prediction would come true. Cruz would play in the NFL for 6 seasons before moving into acting, building a career in comedies, television series, and as a host, becoming one of the most recognizable faces on American television. A member of the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, holds a puppy. The African-American unit spent more time in continuous combat than any other American regiment in the First World War, and never lost a man captured nor yielded a foot of ground to the enemy forces. Slash, before he grew his hair out, playing with his band Titus Sloan at Fairfax High School in 1982. Saul Hudson would form Guns N' Roses 4 years later, becoming one of rock's most recognizable guitarists, with his top hat and Les Paul becoming inseparable visual symbols associated with him. Frank Sinatra, at 17, taking the equivalent of a selfie in 1938. During that period, the young man from Hoboken was beginning to sing in local clubs and dreaming of a musical career. He would become the greatest American popular singer of the 20th century, with a career spanning 6 decades. Gary Sinise, revisiting old photographs, found one of his 6th-grade band, the Beach Dwellers. The actor would build a career in Forrest Gump and the series CSI NY, but kept his passion for music, founding the Lieutenant Dan Band, which performs for American military personnel and veterans worldwide. Alan Turing, a British mathematician, is known for having broken the Nazi Enigma machine, shortening the war by years. Turing was also a founder of modern computer science. Persecuted for his homosexuality, he was sentenced to chemical castration and died in 1954, receiving a posthumous pardon in 2013. Joan Jett, without her characteristic black eyeliner, in 1976. That year, she was a member of the Runaways, a band of teenage girls that opened doors for women in hard rock. She would later form the Blackhearts and score with I Love Rock and Roll, becoming the absolute godmother of female punk. A Lady and Her Horse on a Snowy Day in 1899, photographed by Félix Thiollier. The French industrialist became a highly talented amateur photographer, documenting landscapes and everyday life in the Loire region with a pictorial sensibility that brought his work close to Impressionist painting. The Harlem Hellfighters, returning from the First World War, wearing their Croix de Guerre medals in 1919. The African-American regiment fought under French command because American troops refused to serve alongside black soldiers and received the highest military decoration awarded by France. Tourists in the 1920s, before Cairo's expansion, gaze at the desert from the top of the Great Pyramid. Climbing the pyramids was a common tourist practice at the time, now strictly forbidden because it damages the monuments and because it caused numerous accidental deaths over the following decades. Diana Rigg as Emma Peel in The Avengers in the 1960s. The character was revolutionary in presenting a secret agent who was intellectually brilliant and physically capable, treated as an equal by her male partner. Rigg would later excel in Shakespearean theater and in Game of Thrones decades later. Gordon Ramsay being trained by Marco Pierre White in the 1980s. White was the youngest chef to earn 3 Michelin stars and was known for his explosive temperament in the kitchen. Ramsay absorbed both the technique and the style of his mentor, becoming himself a global television phenomenon. Lithuania's financial situation after independence left it nearly unable to field an Olympic basketball team. The band Grateful Dead sponsored the squad in 1992, funding the tie-dye uniforms that became legendary when the Lithuanians won the bronze medal in Barcelona before the watching world. The day sweet rationing ended in England in 1953. Food rationing remained in force in the United Kingdom for 14 years, surviving long past the end of the Second World War. The end of restrictions on sweets caused enormous queues and spontaneous celebrations by children across the entire country. Bob Ross with his pet squirrels in 1991. The American painter became famous for the program The Joy of Painting, broadcast for decades, and for his calm voice and messages of encouragement. He frequently rescued injured wild animals, which occasionally appeared during his television recordings. Windows on the World, the restaurant atop the former World Trade Center in the 1980s. Located on the 107th floor of the North Tower, it was among the highest-grossing restaurants in the United States. All of its employees who were present on site died in the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, a devastating loss for the restaurant community. New Yorkers stopped to watch the final episode of Seinfeld in Times Square on May 14, 1998. Roughly 76 million people watched the series finale, one of the largest audiences in American television history. The city practically came to a standstill that night for the collective viewing event. Iranian women take to the streets en masse, protesting against the new revolutionary religious government and its dress codes. The demonstrations occurred in 1979, shortly after the Islamic Revolution, when mandatory veiling began to be imposed, reversing decades of women's social gains in the country. LAPD officers disguised themselves as women to infiltrate and catch a purse snatcher in 1960. Disguise tactics were a common resource in American police departments of that era, especially in cases of repeated street crimes that followed predictable patterns and locations within the cities. A tribute to Debbie Reynolds and Carrie Fisher, 1961. Mother and daughter would die just one day apart in December 2016, an ending that moved the entire world. Reynolds was the star of Singin' in the Rain, and Fisher would become eternal as Princess Leia in the Star Wars saga, a role she carried for 4 decades. Stephen Fry's words to live by in the early 1980s. The British actor, writer, and comedian built a multifaceted career and also became known for speaking publicly about his struggle with bipolar disorder, helping to reduce the stigma surrounding mental illness in Britain and far beyond it. A man smoking uses an acoustic coupler to send an electronic message from a public telephone in the early 1980s. The coupler allowed data transmission over the phone line by fitting the handset into a rubber cradle, an ingenious solution that preceded modern modems and the widespread internet. John Travolta, with his sisters Anne and Ellen in 1976. That year, Travolta was known for the series Welcome Back, Kotter, and was about to explode worldwide with Saturday Night Fever in Greece. His entire family worked in the performing arts, with several sisters also acting professionally. A woman advertises full board with a bed and 3 daily meals for a hotel in 1979. Adjusted for inflation, the price charged at the time reveals how much the cost of lodging and food has changed over the decades. Full board arrangements were common in small towns and American tourist regions. Ridley Scott directs Demi Moore and Viggo Mortensen on the set of G.I. Jane in 1997. Moore shaved her head on camera and personally performed the grueling military training depicted in the film, which addressed the integration of women into elite combat units of the American Armed Forces. Betty Brosmer, the pin-up queen whose curves redefined 1950s glamour. Brosmer appeared on more magazine covers than any model of her era and later became a pioneer of women's fitness alongside her husband Joe Weider, publishing widely on health and physical exercise for several decades afterward. Princess Maria of Romania, future Queen of Yugoslavia, on her wedding day in 1922. Daughter of King Ferdinand I, she married Alexander I and became Queen Consort. After her husband's assassination in 1934, she lived in exile in England until her death, far from the country she had once governed.